Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the final session of today in Net Zero Week, where we're going to have a very interesting conversation about financing net zero, financing sustainability. And I know that we're going to get some very interesting insights from our speaker this morning, who is Pretorius. More about him in a second. But I'd just like to thank everybody, for logging on to the week, and to thank as well our sponsors for Net Zero Week: Beyondly, Hitachi Zero Carbon, Manpower, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, and Ramboll for their support. My name's Andy Walker. I'm a construction journalist and one of the contributors to Climate Perspectives, which is the online magazine that writes a lot about sustainability, net zero issues as well. So I have with me Joe Pretorius. Welcome to you, Joe. Joe is the founder of Toco currency, which we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail in a second. He's also an entrepreneur dedicated to addressing humanity's most pressing issue, and that is the one that we're all here to talk about, and that's climate change. Joe has a background in chemical engineering and also a track record of founding successful digital ventures. He's now focused on revolutionising the fight against climate change through Toco digital currency and the carbon reserves. And hopefully, during the course of this conversation, we'll explore how Toco aims to surpass current net zero goals, ensuring better money for a better world. And hopefully we'll get to that point during the course of the conversation. Joe, you have said in the past that our current net zero goals and offsets are not enough. In what way will Toco make the difference? And also, how does it work?
Thanks, Andy, and welcome to everyone listening. So Toco is a global digital currency where every unit in supply is entirely backed by carbon mitigation outcomes, such as carbon credits and carbon offsets. You can use this digital currency like you use normal currency. You can trade it for other currencies. You can use it for everyday transactions to purchase, let's say, your local coffee, or go to the hairdresser, or you can use it as an alternative store for value. And Toco fundamentally looks to do a number of things to assist in this fight against climate change. And the first is to make climate action for each and every person out there, every individual, every organization, as easy and as cost effective as possible. Secondly, to provide carbon markets with a fresh, new, and massive source of demand to help expand those markets significantly, so we can meet the goals that we're going to, the decarbonisation goals that we're going to need to meet in order to meet our stated targets. And thirdly, to provide a means to overhaul our economic system that's currently failing us and causing the market failure, that's causing the overproduction of these carbon emissions that we seem unable to stem, so we can create deep links between our economic activity and achieving our sustainability goals. And effectively, the way that Toco works is we're promoting this currency, getting individuals to use the currency, getting merchants to accept the currency when they sell goods or services to individuals. And the basic idea is that the currency is backed by carbon assets in the same way that our money used to be backed by gold under the gold standard. So the more the currency gets into circulation, in other words, the more people use it for their everyday money needs, the more and more carbon mitigation in the form from credits and offsets and allowances are actually required to back that currency. And in that way, as the economy grows and the value of the economy grows, so does the money that needs to represent it, and therefore we transmit massive sources of demand towards the carbon markets. And that's basically Toco in a nutshell.
You talk about this concept of better money for a better world. What do you mean by that in reality?
Well, in reality, I think And if we just step back a minute and we think about what is the real origin of the problem that we have today, and the real origin that we have is unmitigated carbon emissions that continue to grow. And what really causes that problem? What causes that problem is a massive market failure of our current economic system, right? Because the costs of emissions, the impact of pollutions on society and individuals as a whole, is simply not accounted for in our economic model. So if we think about the producers of carbon emissions and even us as consumers, we all benefit from these carbon emissions, but we share none of the societal or environmental costs that come with them. So perversely, our economic system is perversely incentivized to overproduce it, and we sit with this tragedy, this classic collective action dilemma creates this tragedy of the common where we're all overexploiting the resource. And I mean, to be fair, it's been 30 years since Kyoto. We've had, I don't know, what number COP are we on now? And carbon emissions have still continued to rise by 40%. What we are doing is not working. By no objective means. The carbon markets where they are have failed tremendously. They're small, they're opaque, they're illiquid, and we're not meaningfully abating carbon emissions. And that's where my view is that what we need to do is we need to go at the heart of the problem. We need to go at our economic system and we need to overhaul it. At the moment, when you think of our economy and how it works, right, is like our economy prioritizes the achievement of personal and private gain above everything else. What we need is a new economic system where the achievement of sustainability goals and preserving the planet, the planetary boundaries is made inherent in our economic system. And we think that a currency linked to carbon goes a long way in demonstrating how you can have an economic system where at least the economic growth is somehow constrained by the planetary boundaries, and you do that via the money supply. And in this way, I fundamentally believe that it is possible for us to create an economic system that both prioritizes human well-being but respects the planetary boundaries. And we think that a currency that is inherently, whose value is inherently based on a planet positive outcome, such as carbon mitigation, is going to create a better world, because the more of this money we use, the more carbon mitigation will be incentivized and demanded. And secondly, we'll ultimately create a better world, because we will have an economy that is at least safe and just and prosperous and respects the limits of what our planet can do, because we're going to need the planet for a thriving economy and to sustain our civilization. There are no jobs on a dead planet.
I get where you're coming from with that, and I think you're right to highlight the part of the problem with things like offsets, the lack of credibility of carbon credits. But given how underdeveloped and risky, you have to say, much of the voluntary carbon market is, how will Toco guard against that and basically go the same way?
Well, I think let's look at what I like to call carbon mitigation assets. It's things like carbon credits and carbon offsets. Andy, you rightly point out that they soiled with credibility concerns. The press has obviously done a good job in finding, let's say, morally pliable behavior in these markets and how they are created. But let me just step back from that and let us reflect on the fundamentals. There is no future. There is no future for us in which negative emissions don't play a role. So no matter what anybody wants to tell us, or that we want to look away from this problem, we are going to require negative emissions. And they are going to have to come from either technological carbon engineering kind of sources. And there is no future in which using our natural sinks and natural sequestration methods are not going to play a role. We simply have to preserve and we have to maintain these planetary sinks. So are we going to need people to invest in actions to create mitigation outcomes that reduce, avoid, and sequester emissions. Absolutely. I think it's a fool's paradise that you're living in if you think that we're not going to need that. So if we are going to need that, what we are going to need is we're going to need a functioning carbon market. And what does a functioning carbon market look like? A functioning carbon market is one that is liquid, that is unified globally, where these assets that trade currently are less opaque. They are not happening over the counter. And where we've got enough demand and liquidity sloshing around in that market, that all the actors in that market are incentivized to ensure the quality and the credibility of these assets. Where we find ourselves currently it's called the voluntary carbon market. Why is it called the voluntary carbon market? Because there's a couple of oaks that are trying to do good, and then you have snake oilists coming in there spoiling the party for everyone. The reason it's called voluntary is because it needed to start up because our governments couldn't find the cooperation and the agreements to make them work in the first place. But I think to abandon these markets would be an absolute massive mistake on our trajectory to solving the climate crisis, because we're going to need these markets to function. So how do we envision doing that? So in the Toco concept, we sort of see three pillars. The first pillar that we're doing right now is that when we issue the currency is backed by a portfolio of carbon credits. Now, why do we do a portfolio? It's because we think that the pooling of carbon credit risk at a central level helps everybody in the market. It helps everybody who owns a Toco, because the Toco takes a carbon credit and makes it fungible, and you don't have to compare all of these heterogeneous assets amongst each other. But secondly, we get this pooling of risk advantage, so that no single credit in the system can undermine the system, because you get the benefit of the portfolio diversification. You don't have over concentration of a specific credit. So that's the first thing that we do within the Toco system to limit the risk that we agree is there at the moment. The second thing that we do is we actively manage that portfolio. So monitor and understand these risks on an active basis and adjust that portfolio as needed. But we also look at the risks that are embedded in each of these individual credits. And we take an approach that the financial industry has for a long time taken with a market that's very similar to carbon credits, and that's the debt market. And how do they deal with the debt market? Well, they assess the risks of various forms of debt out there, and then they risk adjust it. So we do the same. We risk adjust the credits and then add sufficient buffers to ensure that we're holding more face value of the credit than what we are claiming the underlying achievable mitigation is. So that's what we're doing in the short term. But importantly, we think if we can generate enough demand by capturing the imagination of the public out there and getting people to transact in Toco and using that money need to transmit demand into these markets, we're also transforming the way that we think about a carbon credit. At the moment, a carbon credit is a cost. It is something that you pay and then you retire it and you throw it away, which is analogous in my mind to like buying a bottle of wine and then pouring it out. So, and if the market is set up that way, and you know you're going to be pouring out the wine, you would just buy the cheapest, poorest quality wine that you can possibly get. But when we start thinking of a carbon credit as an asset that backs an actual currency that represents you and my's version of value or how we store value, then suddenly the entire chain is incentivized to make certain that that asset is credible, because everybody's value is tied up in that asset. And then we transform and change the perspective that we have on these assets. So again, we think that by thinking of carbon credits as the basis for money, you actually change the entire game, because you transform these assets and these credits and offsets, not from expenditures that some sustainability officer somewhere needs to satisfy some marketing budget. You change it into an underlying asset. And I'd like to even go further, that once you've made this transformation, think about what that might mean to our natural sinks, things like the oceans and the forests. In a system where carbon mined or carbon credits are thought of as the equivalent as gold bars. Effectively, these natural sinks, they become income yielding assets rather than just resources to exploit. And that potentially gives the world an alternative means to look at some of its natural resources and its economic value rather than just, the short-term sort of exploitational value that exists.
So that's what you mean then by kind of redesigning the rules for the carbon market, to actually do it in a different way that actually brings out what you've just said there, and maybe avoid some of the pitfalls that we've currently found ourselves in. Would that be a fair assessment?
I think that the way that the carbon markets work now and the mechanisms that have been created and the registries that are there, to a certain extent, that let's call it the piping and the engineering of the market is fine. It just doesn't have enough liquidity, number one, and two, it has no source of demand, actual real world demand. All of the demand is tied up in ethics and compliance. That's made up. And it can change politically from 1 year to the next, and it's highly difficult also to find cooperation and an agreement around compliance and ethics demands because it sits so much in the eye of the beholder. What I'm suggesting is just use the carbon markets as they are now, use those credits, but it's what you use those credits for that I think changes the game. And if we use them as the basis for creating our money, then we change the way that we think about carbon credits and carbon offsets and carbon mitigation. We start thinking of them as valuable assets, not as costs that we have to incur for compliance purposes or, putting lipstick on the pig of our net zero goals.
So, in terms of that, seeing them as assets, I mean, what you're explaining here, kind of sounds like, well, why wouldn't you do it? So, how do we get to critical mass with Toco? And also, I have to ask, if the solution and the benefits are so transparently obvious, why haven't governments or the banking institutions not embraced it? And how do we get them to do that?
Look, I mean, I'm 100% convinced this is where it ends, that the banks embrace it. And the central banks embrace it. I mean, that's a very interesting point, Andy. Is how would you do it today? I think if the 4 or 5 prominent central banks of the world, the US Fed, the ECB, China, and Japan got together, and if you think about their monetary mandates at the moment, right? It's basically they all have dual mandates, roughly along the lines of let's maximize employment and let's keep prices stable. What I'm arguing is for them to implement it is actually simple. They just add a third leg to that mandate. It's keep prices stable, maximize employment, and keep atmospheric carbon concentration stable. That's as simple as that. And the way that they would enact that is they would simply say to the market, they would say to the commercial banks that the money supply is now also dependent on whether we are achieving certain atmospheric carbon reductions, and the way that we reflect those carbon reductions is in the form of carbon credits, and that the Federal Reserve and the ECB will buy those credits and keep them on the Federal Reserve and central bank's balance sheet as the backing for the currency that they put in supply. You do that, it is then possible for them to signal to the entire market how much credits they will buy, over what period, thereby unlocking the entire investment landscape. And the commercial banks themselves, because they know that they won't be able to increase their money supply or extend their loans if they don't have these support of these carbon credits with the Reserve Bank, will be naturally incentivized to invest. So I think it is blatantly obvious, and I think if you go and read the literature and some of the work that the World Bank and the WF has done and academics in the 2000s, this is not a novel idea. It's an idea that has been spoken about and is even now, I think, through the Kim Stanley Robinson book, Ministry of the Future, is sort of starting to drift up to the zeitgeist, where he also talks about as sort of a carbon based currency. So I think this is where they end. I think that the problem for them is who moves first and how do they find the agreement amongst themselves, because by putting that into your mandate, you are effectively placing a brake on your economy relative to the others. If everybody else places the brake, I think that's fine, and they've got some idea. But which central bank and politician is going to be brave enough to do that? So this is where we as Toco come in. We've spent the last 2 years because we think that's going to take too long. We think it's where they end up, but we just think we need to accelerate this. So we spent the last 2 years developing the institution. We've created a foundation in Geneva that manages, the alternative money system, and which you can think of as the central carbon reserve, and it holds the credits that backs the currency. And then we're issuing currency onto a payment platform that anybody with a phone can access over the internet. So you can start paying with the currency, immediately. And we started deploying that into Zurich and into Denmark at the moment, into Copenhagen. We've also priorly tested it in a couple of locations, and our objective is to go and try and speak to people, individuals out there, and say, you guys who are climate conscious, time to put your money where your mouth is, literally. Why don't you take a portion of your US dollars and your euros that you have in your bank account now and put them in carbon mitigation outcomes and use that form of money rather? Because when you use that form of money, you're supporting the expansion of carbon markets. When you use your government's money, you're supporting the expansion of government debt. So if you are really climate conscious and you want to make an impact, this doesn't cost you anything. You keep continuing with your life as you previously did. You're just literally using better money for a better outcome and a better world. And our hope is that we can find enough of these individuals who want to demonstrate to the world that we need to change our economic model and that we can create a couple of pockets of thriving markets where Toco is circulating in the economy. Individuals are using it, not for all their money, clearly, but for a portion, of their daily spend, if it's for your coffee or your hair or at your local restaurant, to such an extent that we can provide an example to the governments and the policymakers of this world, and to say, okay, here it is working. We don't have to talk about it. Here's a shining example, and start placing pressure on them to elevate that conversation, so that they can rethink about how their monetary frameworks work. And for me, that is ultimately success. If we can nudge them and accelerate them at where they ultimately are going to end up, then I think we would have done a great job.
So let's say you are successful and demand exponentially sort of really increases. How will you handle that increased demand? So let's say, we start seeing it adopted, across the whole of Europe, for example. How will you scale up to make sure that this actually does continue to work, basically?
Well, I think this is the beauty of it. We'll do it responsibly. So if you have lots of demand for the currency, for the Toco, because people want to use it in their everyday lives, and there isn't enough supply available, what will happen to the price of the Toco? The price of the Toco will increase, and that will make it possible for the carbon reserve to offer higher prices into the carbon market to encourage the investment to do that. So the moment you can create this mismatch of demand between people demanding the currency because they're demanding it because they want to make climate action, but they're using it for their current needs that exist already. You're not having to fabricate it. It's as you're using money already, Andy. Then we create a mismatch between the supply and the demand for the underlying carbon credit asset, and that allows the carbon reserve to do a number of things: to push prices up in the market, so we can start investing up the cost of abatement curve, and making that profitable and economically viable for those kind of projects. And it will also naturally become possible for the carbon reserve, if it's got a strong source of demand, to start buying future offtake contracts, which makes it then obviously much more fundable for those entities to invest to invest in those projects. But what I'm not suggesting, Andy, is that because we have a huge deluge of demand, that we just then issue the currency willy-nilly because we have that demand. No, we need to restrict that currency supply to match what is available. That is exactly what you'll need to transmit pricing to the carbon markets that they so desperately need.
So you say that on the one hand, Toco will increase demand for carbon reduction, but also give people a simple means to participate in climate action. I mean, that sounds like a win-win to me, quite frankly, and underpins a lot of what we've been discussing over the past 3 days as part of Net Zero Week. So, increasing support for obviously carbon reduction and also giving ordinary people agency in that process to participate. So, how practically will Toco do that?
Well, practically it's simple, and is you download the app, you buy some tokens at the current exchange rate, and you can now do with those tokens as you do with what you do with other money. If you decide to store some value, so you just want to keep some savings in Toco, what you are doing is you're literally saving in carbon credits and carbon offsets, right? So you can save in it that way. That's placing demand. They're saying, I as Andy, I want to save for my holiday at the end of the year. So how am I going to save? I'm going to save it in Toco. That creates demand. You could also go down to your local coffee shop and convince them to accept Toco, and then every day you walk down, you buy a cup of coffee with a Toco. In order for that transaction to take place, the Toco needs to exist. In order for that token to exist, some carbon credit behind it needs to exist. So what you're doing for ordinary people here is you're allowing them to continue with their normal lives in a normal fashion. So it doesn't cost you anything to take climate action. You don't have to change your habits. You're just changing the way that you are paying. And what that is doing is that is generating demand signals towards the carbon market. If we could get every single European just to buy 1 cup of coffee a day, just 1 cup of coffee a day in a currency backed by carbon, that would generate $30 billion worth of fresh demand to the voluntary carbon market. That will expand it from where it's today 15 times. And that's just by asking Europeans to take a $5 risk on their cup of coffee every day, because I don't need you to load $300 in it or 300 euros. Just load 5, buy your coffee. Load 5, buy your coffee. But every time you load 5, you're asking for $5 worth of carbon to be sequestrated somewhere. So why the hell wouldn't we do that?
Joe, I've got a final question here, and I think I probably know the answer to this because you sound like a confident and driven individual. Are you confident that you can get the world to adopt what, in effect, amounts to a new currency?
And yeah, I'm confident that the solution works. I'm confident that if the world adopts it at a reasonable scale, we'll have such a massive effect on the carbon markets that it will have a very binary effect and will be very, very successful. I think the challenge is always moving individuals, getting them out of their apathy, getting them to take a little bit of personal risk to try something new, and collectively march forward. But personally, I'm a positive individual. I have faith in humanity. They've demonstrated for decades that when faced with adversity, they can come together. You just need to make it easy for people. And I think that we are making it easy for people, and I think that people will come and they will put their money where their mouth is, and they will use better money to create a better world, because what's the downside? So yes, Andy, lots of pitfalls ahead, lots of work to do. There will be lots of criticisms. There will be a couple of crises in the carbon markets, no doubt. But if anybody is expecting us to get to the end of the solution without a couple of wobbles, then they are fools. But what we definitely need to start doing is working towards solution. And that's what we're trying to do, and we're going to try and make it as easy for you and all the other climate conscious people out there to at least see whether we can make a shot. And I invite everybody to join me. I promise you, there's very little downside here. There's just upside. If we do this, yeah, we can win this battle.
Thanks very much indeed, Joe. Check out the Toco website, which is tocos.org. And actually, I went on the website earlier, and the quote's great. Money doesn't have to cost the earth, which I think really says it all. Joe, thanks very much indeed for sharing your inspirational ideas with us as part of this final session of Net Zero Week. I'd like to thank everybody who's joined us in all of our sessions. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, Beyondly, Hitachi Zero Carbon, Manpower, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, and Ramboll for taking part as well. A reminder that all of our sessions from the week will be available to watch again online. Just watch out for the email that will drop into your inbox. It'll give you the link for all of that. Check out Climate Perspectives as well for ongoing coverage on the issues relating to net zero and sustainability. And a big thanks once again to Joe Pretorius for joining us this morning for what I think has been a really interesting and worthwhile discussion, and one which I hope will actually lead to a different approach to the way that we actually deal with this really vital area, not just for the environment, but for our very future itself. Thanks very much indeed, and we'll see you again very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy.